Welcome to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today we are talking about your mindset while studying for the bar exam. Your Bar Exam Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the bar exam experience so you can study effectively, stay sane, and hopefully pass and move on with your life. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on your favorite listening app and check out our sister podcast, the Law School Toolbox podcast. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on barexamtoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking about mindset and the bar exam. Well, we were actually surprised, as it turns out, we hadn't done this topic because it was our very first topic we ever covered on our first Law School Toolbox podcast.
I know.
We assumed we'd covered it for the bar.
We assumed, and then someone on our team was like, you have not done it.
Yeah, so here
we are.
I
didn't believe them. So
I know, I literally went through the entire list. Was like, did we call it something else? We must have talked about this.
So lucky you, now you get our mindset podcast, something that we talk about all the time.
So I think we touched on it in different guises, but we have not really talked about why mindset is so important for bar study.
Yeah. So it is so important for a bar study because mindset is really like the way that you approach all of this stuff. It's the way that you approach every challenge, every bit of feedback, every day that you wake up studying. It can really change how effectively you study. It can change your mood. It's really like a key piece to all of this stuff.
I think that's right. And I think a lot of the people who don't pass the bar, it's partly because they have a failure of their mindset.
Yeah.
You know, people get so down and they just start thinking like, this is impossible. There's just no way that I can do this. What I'm doing is just not working. It's never going to work. I may as well just not bother studying anymore. You know, maybe you're not thinking these things consciously, but you really do have to kind of pay attention to what you're telling yourself about this test.
And so when we talk about mindset, what we're really referencing is Carol Dweck's definition of this in her book, Mindset, which you can read on your free time. It's quite a good book. I think you can learn a lot about yourself and the way people learn and deal with challenges by reading that book. It can be a good summer read.
I think that's right.
Yeah. But so, Alison, why don't we just give a bit of a primer on what's the difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset, which we're going to talk about a lot today.
Yeah, so this is what she covers in the book. And the fixed mindset is really essentially you have a certain capacity, and once that capacity is reached, there's just not much you can do about it. So you might think like, oh, you know, I'm just not smart enough to pass the bar exam. There's nothing I can do about that. I mean, you can kind of predict what the result of that might be. You're probably not going to really like look at different ways you could be studying. You're probably not going to study that effectively. You know, maybe you go through the motions and you're just like, but deep down, you fundamentally believe that you are not smart enough to do this and you're just not really going to do it.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think, you know, anytime any of us take a lesson in certain things, like, you know, I've been talking a lot about my ski lessons, and when they put me on something like steeper with bumps on it, like the moguls, I was just like, I don't really see the point of this. I may even told my instructors this, like, I don't really see why people would enjoy this. I don't see the point of it. And I'm pretty sure I just can't do it. And they were kind of like, well, if that's your mindset, that's pretty much, yeah, you're right. You're not going to do it. And then I was in a class with an 87-year-old woman, and she was the one who was like, let's go do the moguls. And I'm like, all right, if this 87-year-old woman can at least like kind of do this, maybe I can try. And that really changed everything, because then I started to get a little bit better at it. And then I started to realize like maybe it was kind of fun. And then I was more motivated to try it again. I even went back on my own and I tried it on my own, you know, to see how it went. And then the next day I went out and did it again and I got a little bit better at it. So that is an example of transitioning from this fixed mindset of like, I do not see the point of this. I don't want to do it. I'm not going to try to do it. And like, whatever, which did not result in me being able to do this. Do more of a growth mindset. So the growth mindset is really looking at this as, yes, this is a challenge. Maybe it's not something that I particularly am good at right now or even necessarily want to be that amazing at, but I'm willing to give it a shot. You know, I'm willing to look at this and say, okay, if I wanted to do this, like what are some ways that I could learn to do it?
Yeah.
And then actually execute on those things and try them out and evaluate them and see how they went. And then if they worked, do more of them. If they didn't work, don't do it. So I thought that was actually a good example of me transitioning from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset.
I think that is a really great example. And to stay on the skiing thing, the other thing that we did is we have been helping my son learn to ski.
Right.
And
who's 5.
And children are fascinating to look at when you're thinking about learning, because they don't have a lot of the same layers of bull that we all have,
right?
They're not perfectionists, they don't have, all of this kind of learned dialogue. But one of the pieces that I found us saying to my son when he was uncertain or scared or, unsure is we were really talking a lot about being brave, that it was very brave to do something even when you were scared. It was brave to be uncomfortable and to continue to do it. And that you also had to get down the mountain. So you had to find a way to get down the mountain.
Yeah, there was definitely a point where we're like, all right, we understand that you are not happy about this situation. And frankly, we probably shouldn't have put you in this situation because it's a little steep, even though it's not super dangerous.
Yep.
But we actually don't have a choice because we cannot go back up.
Right.
We have to keep going.
We have to keep going. There is a chairlift down there that's going to take us to where we need to go. And we got to get there. We got to find a way. And I wondered after the fact, because we talked about this experience of working with him, is if we used the language that we were using on my son, on ourselves or on our peers, how different it might be, this idea that it can be brave to be vulnerable and to, study for the bar exam and give it your all. And I think you have people like Brene Brown using some of this language and things like that around shame and vulnerability and courage and, stepping into the arena and all of this stuff that she talks about. But I think a lot of people don't use the same language that we use to work our, have these teachable moments with our children on ourselves.
Right. And I think a lot of it, a lot of the underlying sort of angst around the bar exam really is a fear of failure.
Yeah.
So people may not want to admit that to themselves because that's vulnerable to say oh, I'm afraid I'm going to fail this test. And so then, we have a whole episodes on self-sabotage and that kind of thing. And, I think Brene Brown is the person to turn to on this if you feel like, maybe there is some fear of failure holding you back or maybe some shame, all this sort of stuff. She is great at it. Because that's all stuff, again, you can get through, but it's going to sabotage your work if you don't sort of deal with it.
Yeah. And the other thing I love about her work is her discussions about what being vulnerable really means, and I think that there is really something about being comfortable with vulnerability and giving it your all. Oftentimes when I'm coaching with a student, I will say, what will happen if you do everything you possibly could do to pass and then you don't?
Right.
And then they're they'll be there's kind of this moment where they're really uncomfortable and they don't want to talk about it. And usually they'll be like, well, I will be in the same place I am right now.
Right.
Which is not great, but not awful.
Right. I mean, and, I think the answer to that is well, I'll be really disappointed. Mm-hmm. It's all right, well, you will probably survive that.
Right.
So you may as well try.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what is the cost, and so I think that, it can be interesting if you're finding that this dialogue that you're having yourself is very damaging to think about, how would you talk to yourself if you were a child? Right. How would you talk to yourself if it was somebody else? And another person that we read a lot of is Dan Siegel, who we also like. We have podcasts on his book, Mindsight. Mm-hmm. But one of the things in Mindsight that always sticks with me is he mentions, what we say to ourselves. And what if we talk to ourselves with the same kindness that we would talk to each other? And how many times that we use damaging language to talk to ourselves that we would be astonished if somebody was using to talk to somebody else. And I think I kind of started to listen to my own dialogue about stuff like that. And you do catch yourself being kind of cruel to yourself sometimes.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think, if you're thinking about how you can apply this to the bar world, I mean, one of the things I think people have to look at is what is your self-talk?
Yeah.
What are you saying to yourself when things get hard? If you do a set of MBE questions and you get 50% and you're feeling really bad, what are you saying to yourself about that? Are you saying God, you're so stupid. Right. I can't believe that you missed these. What are you doing?
Right.
Oh, you never should have gone to law school to begin with. God, you're never going to pass.
Right.
People have that in their head.
Oh, for sure.
Versus okay, this is a disappointing moment. I feel shame about this, or I feel, that this is not what I want to be doing, or I'm frustrated by this. All right, take a deep breath, take a step back. What am I going to do to improve it?
Right. But if you contrast like how we often talk to ourselves with like how we were talking to my son like about falling.
Right.
You know, because it's like we were talking about like all great skiers fall. You know, you're a skier if you're pushing yourself enough to fall. You know, it's all about getting up and like all of this stuff. And like every time something would happen, we would have this like positive growth spin on it. You know,
Right.
It's like, you're so brave. You've done it, this or that. And I'm like, we do not talk to ourselves like this.
No.
Most of us. Yeah.
Well, I used to have a theory that if I didn't fall when I was skiing or snowboarding, I wasn't learning anything. I told some instructor that, and they're like, "Wow, that's really weird," because they even really sometimes freak out. Like as a grown up, if you're taking lessons and you fall down, people really freak out about it. I'm like, I'm fine.
Right.
Like, the snow's soft. It's cool. I'm not hurt.
Right. Yeah.
Like, are you upset? I'm like, no, not really. I'm fine. And I think some of this is, making a plan now when you're not in this position of like being really frustrated of how you are going to try to react if you start to get frustrated or you start losing confidence. And part of this, I know one of our tutors, who's really a great tutor, always encourages her students to have this mantra. So they make a mantra that they're going to repeat regularly to themselves. And that can actually be super effective.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of what some of them were, like some of them were like the bite of the elephant or something. One bite at a time and you eat the elephant, or that wouldn't work for me because I'm more literal. So my mantra might be something more like, yes, this is challenging, but I can do it.
Yeah.
It sounds kind of, Saturday Night Live-y, like, oh, this is challenging, I can do it. But if you repeat that to yourself, you're going to believe that.
Yeah.
Versus if you repeat to yourself, oh, this exam is impossible, I'll never pass. Both of those are probably self-fulfilling prophecies.
Yep. I know when I was going through a challenging time, I read a blog post where somebody was talking about grief, and she said it's okay to wade into the river of grief as long as you keep walking, you will eventually get to the other side. And that was a mantra that I really stuck to. It was like, no judgment about being in the river. You just have to keep walking. And I think that like anytime you can have something that you go back to, or I was wasting time on Instagram, which I'm trying to do less of, but they have this site that they had a blanket. Now I found a sweatshirt. It's like the same stuff keeps coming over because I clicked on it once.
Right.
But it was like, beautiful girl, you can do hard things. And I thought, that's also a great mantra. You can do hard things.
Yeah, I've seen that one.
But it's kind of because we're probably clicking on the same stuff on Instagram. But
might follow some of the same people.
Guessing. Yeah, just guessing. But I also think that just like saying something to yourself every day, you can do hard things, is very powerful. Again, we oftentimes say that to children, but we very seldom say that to adults.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So if we're talking about like good mindsets to go into bar prep with, again, like I think this is challenging because you've got to be realistic. You can't just say things like, oh, I can do this. It's like, that's probably less effective actually than saying like, yeah, this is a challenging test, but I can pass it.
And you got to think about how you learn and how you're going to apply that knowledge, just not signing up for some program and just doing what they tell you to do, but really owning and being in charge of your own learning and then pivoting and making changes when necessary.
Yeah, I think that's so critical. I think sometimes people give away their agency when they're studying for the bar. And I think that's a real mistake because you are ultimately the person who has to go in there. You have to take the test. You have to fill in the answers. No one can do this for you. And we see this sometimes even with people who hire tutors. It's like they kind of think like, oh, I hired a tutor, I'm good to go. It's like, well, you still have to do the work.
Right. Because like sometimes people go dark. They stop talking to us.
It's like you're not doing the things that we have asked you to do to pass the test. So therefore, just because you paid for it, it's not actually really helpful unless you, sit down and write these essays. So, and I think one of the, I think it's also a mindset, like really focusing on this active over the passive learning. That is a mindset for bar prep. If you have a choice on what you could be spending time on, choose the more active piece.
Yeah.
Choose the more active thing.
Yeah.
That will almost always land you in a better place at the end than if you consistently choose the more passive activity.
I think that's true. It's also important to plan ahead for stress and anxiety and whatever you're going to need to do to deal with them. And one of the things that I think more since I started doing this sort of work, but I'm always love reading stories about people failing. Failing all things. And you just sent me a New York Times article about Samin, the chef who did salt, fat, acid, heat. She was talking about how she fails. But I also thought that what was interesting about this piece, that this interview was, she was talking about her own failures and struggles. And then she was like, and I go to therapy every week because this is a lot to deal with. And I was like, I just loved how it wasn't like a big deal that she said that. She's like, this is how I cope. Like, this is what I need to like stay grounded. And I think so often we wait for a crisis to do what we need to do to stay grounded. And she was also very honest that she struggled with depression and things like that. But I think that for many of us going into a very hard and challenging time, it should be a default that we then think about like how we're going to hold ourselves up in that challenging time. And when I got ready to have children, both times that I was pregnant, I think that that is a culture of like, who's going to be in your circle?
Right.
You know, like, where's your support network? Who's going to be, you know, who's going to be in the room with you? Who's going to be this?
No one thinks that you're just suddenly going to wake up one day and like have a child.
Right.
Like by yourself in
Right.
your room.
You know? I even had home births and there were a lot of people there.
Yeah. Like no one would even like that expectation would be crazy.
Right. Like, and I took classes and did all of this. Like, there was a lot of preparation and a support network. And I think you need to go into the bar knowing that you're going to need a team to support you. And this is just, you know, an experience in life that is often not discussed, like something like childbirth. Although now having birthed a baby, I'll be honest, that was harder than taking the bar exam. But I think that there is something about like this being a milestone, and what are you going to do to set yourself up with the network that you need to support yourself, so you're going to be ready for the moment. Because in the same way as someday the baby's going to come out, you're going to sit for the test. There's a deadline.
Right. In
it's
fact,
coming.
I think people are sitting for it literally today.
Like, I thought about that when we were doing this. I was like, people are in the exam right now.
Yeah, we're sending you good vibes.
We are sending you
Hopefully
super
you
good
pass.
vibes. Hopefully you pass. I mean, on the East Coast, they should be finishing up. Right now in California, they are into their probably, afternoon of essays.
Mm-hmm. Fun times.
Fun times.
Yeah, but I think, that idea of like figuring out what help you're personally going to need with this and then lining that up. And that doesn't have to be, a therapist or a coach or a tutor. It can be, but it could also just be, getting an unlimited yoga pass to your favorite yoga studio, which I did when I was studying for the bar. Mm-hmm. And I would sometimes go twice a day.
Yeah.
And finally someone, after I'd gone twice a day for about a week, they were sort of like, what
are you doing?
Working? Like, what are you doing? And I said, oh, I'm studying for the bar exam. And she's like, oh, maybe you should come 3 times. But like that was really helpful to me. And so like, yeah, it was a slight financial commitment, but I think it probably drastically helped me because it was,
Probably cheaper than therapy.
Cheaper than therapy, definitely cheaper than therapy. It was cheaper than failing the bar. Mm-hmm. And it made me, sleep better and be able to retain information better. So, you can't just go at this like, oh, I'm just going to study 14 hours a day and that's going to make me pass. Like, this has to be more of a balance.
Yeah. Yeah. So you got to think about this before and then during. I think that if you're struggling, you got to take a step back and say like, I got to pivot, because just staying in the struggle, that is not empowering. That is not the growth mindset of just being like, I'm drowning, so I'm just going to stay drowning.
Right. I mean, things really, let's face it, are not likely to get much better on their own if you just do nothing or you keep doing the same thing. Yep. If you are starting to feel your mindset being derailed during bar prep, which is a very common experience.
Super common.
Like it starts off well and you're all excited about it and you've just graduated and you're like got your new materials and you got your fresh books and your fresh highlighters and you're feeling all good about it. And that usually lasts for like, a week. And then things start getting harder and you start getting bored and frustrated and,
then around week 4, the panic attacks set in.
Yeah. So then, things start spiraling downward. You're not seeing the progress you want to see. Your MBE scores are not going up. And you're just tired. You've been doing this for a long time. You're like really annoyed with the whole thing. All of these things can really start to derail your mindset.
Yeah.
So like fear and anxiety literally will take your brain offline.
Yeah. You literally cannot think. The blood is not sent to your brain, and therefore you cannot retain information and think clearly.
Yeah. And I think Dan Siegel talks a lot about this, just like that interactivity between like your emotional state and your mental state and your ability to function in the world. I mean, you just start being able not to focus and not to retain information. And whether it's test anxiety happening in that moment in the test room or whether it's anxiety happening during your study time, this is not going to help. You know, like you have to do something about this.
Yeah. And one of the things that we incorporate into our one-on-one tutoring programs is we have meditations and kind of exercises that a friend of ours wrote kind of about these topics to help you move through some of these emotions. And, maybe you think we're a little woohoo, and that's fine. Sometimes we can be a little woohoo. But even when I was going through the exercise of like talking to her about these and recording them. And I would sit in the studio and I'm listening, and, it'd be like, and then put your hand on top of your hand and like feel that somebody's like touching you and comforting you, because there's literally science to show that even if you like touch your own hand, it is comforting.
Interesting.
It doesn't even have to be somebody else's hand or like stroking your own hand. And I was like, wow, we are such powerful beings that we can do these small things like breathing or petting your hand or, just to shift our consciousness and keep our mindset in the right space.
Well, and there's a lot of science around this too.
Right.
I've been going to restorative yoga classes, for example. And there, people might think like, well, you just like lay around on the ground for an hour. What could this possibly do? But what you're doing is you're activating the parasympathetic nervous system, which is what actually calms you down.
Mm-hmm.
And, we're all running around in like this heightened alert state of stress all the time. And we have all this like crazy stuff going on. And that's not actually good for your brain or your body. So even taking an hour in the evening to like literally, I went yesterday and we did 2 postures the entire night.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, they weren't hard. We just laid there.
Yeah.
But it actually is really helpful, and your brain starts going into this other place, and you start relaxing and your body relaxes, and then you sleep better.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think carving out something like that, and you can do a lot of these online now.
Yeah, that's true.
Basically, if there's not a studio near you that you want to go and have your props and lay around in, I'm sure you can find this online.
Mm-hmm.
And it could make a huge difference.
Yeah.
Just taking that hour out of your day to really consciously relax your brain and your body.
Yeah. And it doesn't even have to be an hour, but yeah, I went to a restorative workshop once. I think it was 3.5 hours. I think we did like 6 poses or something like that. But, you would hold these poses for these long time and you have no concept of time.
Right.
Because you're just like in this
also the thing.
Very bizarre state.
Yeah. The instructor at this class, it's funny because I don't know if she's doing it. I mean, she might be, I don't know if she's doing it intentionally or not, but she'll say something like, we're going to hold this pose for 20 breaths. And then it's like 40 minutes, And I'm like, I'm not really counting breaths, but I know that was more than 20.
I've moved on from 20 breaths.
But it's sort of fine. It was always just like, I think it's sort of, 20 breaths means like a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the reality is everybody's going to find something to be able to relax yourself, but you've got to develop some coping mechanisms so you can show up with the calm, right mindset. I feel like we're talking about my kids a lot, but again, the things that I hear myself saying to my kid, I'm like, if only I listened to myself as much. So, my son was like, oh, I'm thinking scary thoughts. I can't go to sleep. Of course I was like, what are the scary thoughts? And then I don't think they're really that scary thoughts. But my response was, well, you can replace those scary thoughts with happy thoughts. So why don't you start thinking about happy things? Think about, and we started listing off all the things that kind of makes him happy. And then I was like, maybe that's something that all of us should choose to do sometimes, because I think we can all get caught up in this like internal dialogue of frustration and anxiety. And, it's like, what if and I think that Dan Siegel does talk about this. So we have the power to say like, I'm going to choose to think about this other thing.
Right. Well, this is when I go back to the mantra idea.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's why the mantra is actually really helpful. If it's something that you can remember in the moment. And, the Buddhist people talk a lot about this. Like if you're doing mindfulness stuff, you're actually training your brain.
Right.
So what you're training for is the ability that in the moment when everything is falling apart, that you go back to what you've been training.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you have a mantra, and I don't really care what it is, but it's something that needs to appeal to you so that every time you start to be like, oh my God, like this is just not going well, like, okay, this is challenging, but I can do it.
Mm-hmm.
And then that immediately resets you back to a more positive place.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So the other thing that you need to be aware of, besides like all this stuff that you're doing for yourself, is who you are surrounding yourself with.
Oh my gosh, this is so important when you're in bar prep.
So important in bar prep. Because if you are only hanging out with negative and stressed people, that is not going to help you stay in a positive mindset.
No, people are very sociable. We are basically sociable creatures who are like literally our brains are, have these things called mirror neurons.
Mm-hmm.
And the mirror neurons basically pick up on other people's emotional states and then you mirror that.
Mm-hmm.
So you can imagine what this is going to do when you have a whole room full of like really stressed out people all the time. And they're all getting more and more stressed out because they're all mirroring each other's negative emotions.
Yeah.
So again, I think this is just a place you have to be aware of. Like, is this group of people that you're studying with, are they helpful?
Yeah.
Are they helping your emotional state? If not, you got to find some other people.
Yeah. Or remove yourself from the situation.
Or not have
or not have people at all.
This is where I think like an exercise class, if it's a positive class or like a yoga class or a running group or whatever, can be really helpful, because it can be extremely helpful just to be around other people who are not in like a negative spiral.
Right. Absolutely. And who are going to probably be more positive. So, I remember one of my best friends going to dinner with her when I was studying for the bar. She may have made a comment how I was still wearing the same like Columbia zip-up fleece that I'd been wearing like the last few times that she'd seen me. But, and I was complaining about this or that. And, she was like, "You're smart. You can do this." She's not a lawyer, and we know each other a long time. It was kind of like refreshing to just have somebody be like, "I hear you. It's going to be fine." And I think that there can be a dismissive feedback from people who are like, "Why are you worried?
Don't worry. You're so smart."
But, I think this was more like sincerely, like, you're doing what you need to do. You're going to be fine. But maybe you should put on a different fleece.
Yeah, no, I remember when I took California, when I was working and I really had not studied sufficiently, I ran into someone that I knew from law school who was also taking the exam. And, we had been on law review together. And I was at that point, 50-50 if I was going to pass. And that was probably pretty realistic. But I saw him and he's like, "Oh my God, I'm so happy to see you." And I was like, "Why?" He's like, "I just wanted to see somebody else that I knew was going to pass." And I was like, "You know what? I have talked to 6 or 7 people earlier today. Pretty sure they were all, statistically speaking, going to fail. I know you are going to pass." Yeah. He's like, "You're going to pass too." He's like, "I just wanted to meet somebody this morning that I was pretty sure was going to pass."
Yeah.
And we were being pretty realistic. Mm-hmm. I mean, most people I had talked to probably were going to fail. It was like their 7th time taking it. They'd gone to a non-accredited law school. So you started to see like kind of why the pass rates were where they were for the February bar.
Yeah. So one other thing that we've kind of touched on, but I think that it's important to go ahead and pull out is, taking care of yourself and actively managing obstacles is so important. So this includes sleep. Sleep is a form of torture. Sleep deprivation. Sleep is not a form of torture. Sleep deprivation is a form of torture. And you literally cannot remember things if you don't process. Sleep. You don't process. And I was listening to Malcolm Gladwell's newest book, Talking to Strangers, where they actually are talking about torture to just lighten the mood, right. Let's talk about torture. But what he was actually talking about was that they use sleep deprivation as a form of interrogation techniques, and that there are a group of neuroscientists who are saying you are likely not getting accurate memories, even if the people believe they are accurate memories, because the sleep deprivation is changing the memories. And that there's a risk that the material that you're getting, even though if people truly believe that that might be the truth, that this sleep deprivation is actually changing their memories. And that maybe
sounds counterproductive.
It does. So I think that it is just important to realize that hopefully you're not like torturing yourself with the lack of sleep, but that it is not going to put your brain in a place that you can function. And so you need to figure out how to give yourself rest. You also need to move your body, because sitting in one spot makes you feel like junk.
Yeah. And again, like I think they're finding out exercise is actually good for learning and retention and things like that. So, I think this has to be, like, it sounds weird to say you have to have a balanced plan for preparing for the bar, because it's not typically a very balanced time in most people's lives. But, I think you are better off studying an hour or two less per day and doing some exercise, like taking time off and actually doing, something that's truly relaxing, and having time to eat adequate food and sleep. These things are going to be more valuable than one extra hour of study. Yeah, absolutely. And you've got to just remember that all of this stuff just folds into this overall plan to get you where you need to be. And that this is absolutely something that is doable. You just have to find the path to make it happen. Yeah. Lots and lots of people have managed to pass the bar, and you can be one of those people. Yeah. You just have to go into it with the right mindset of like, I'm going to figure out how to make this happen, and then do it. Yep. All right. Well, with that, we are out of time. I want to take a second to remind you to check out our blog at barexamtoolbox.com, which is full of helpful tips to help you prepare and stay sane as you study for the bar exam.
You can also find information on our website about our courses, tools, and one-on-one tutoring programs to support you as you study for the UBE or California Bar Exam. If you enjoyed this episode of the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you are still in law school, you might also like to check out our popular Law School Toolbox podcast as well. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Allison at lee@barexamtoolbox.com or allison@barexamtoolbox.com, or you can always reach us via our website contact form at barexamtoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.